En octobre 2024, le collectif Forensic Architecte publie un rapport intitulé « Cartographie d'un génocide » et consacré à la campagne militaire israélienne dans la bande de Gaza au cours de l'année précédente. Le document de plus de 800 pages est accompagné d'une plateforme cartographique interactive construite à partir d'une très grande quantité de photos, de vidéos et d'images satellites. Il entend démontrer que les actes de violence infligés à la population gazaoui et à son environnement relèvent d'un projet génocidaire. Le rapport vient appuyer la plainte contre Israël déposée par l'Afrique du Sud à la Cour internationale de justice en décembre 2023, ainsi que le travail de la rapporteure spéciale des Nations Unies sur les territoires palestiniens. Forensic Architecte est le nom du groupe de chercheurs militants à l'initiative de cartographie d'un génocide, mais aussi de la discipline qu'ils ont contribué à créer. Fondé à Londres en 2010 et basé à l'université Goldsmiths, le collectif rassemble des architectes, des vidéastes, des informaticiens, des avocats et des journalistes. Leur travail d'investigation et de modélisation multimodale consiste à reconstituer et à exposer des crimes commis par des États, en retournant contre eux les outils forensiques qu'ils sont d'ordinaire les seuls à manier. Conduite à la demande d'associations locales ou en partenariat avec des organisations de défense des droits humains, les enquêtes de Forensic Architecte sont presque aussi nombreuses que les conflits qui déchirent la planète. Elles ont notamment porté sur des attaques de drones illégalement menées par l'armée américaine, sur le bombardement d'hôpitaux par les aviations russes et israéliennes, sur des violences policières en Turquie, au Mexique, en Colombie et au Royaume-Uni, sur des crimes environnementaux commis en Indonésie et en Grèce, sur l'implication des autorités européennes dans la disparition de migrants en Méditerranée, sur l'occultation de preuves dans le traitement officiel d'incendies criminels à Londres et à Lesbos, ou encore sur les accointances des services secrets allemands avec des terroristes d'extrême droite. Eyal Weizman, architecte israélo-britannique et professeur à l'université Goldsmiths, est le fondateur et le directeur de Forensic Architecture. Avant d'aborder les conditions de production et la réception de cartographie d'un génocide, nous lui avons demandé de revenir sur les origines, la méthodologie et les évolutions du travail de Forensic Architecture, ainsi que sur les rapports privilégiés que le collectif n'a cessé d'entretenir avec la cause palestinienne. Pour établir le caractère génocidaire des agissements du gouvernement israélien à Gaza depuis octobre 2023, Eyal Weizman et ses collègues sont partis du texte de la Convention pour la prévention et la répression du crime de génocide, et en particulier de la clause qui qualifie de génocide la soumission d'un groupe à des conditions d'existence devant entraîner sa destruction physique totale ou partielle. Telle est en effet l'intention que trahissent les massacres et les déplacements forcés de civils, mais aussi la destruction systématique du bâti et des infrastructures, de la culture et de l'agriculture gazaoui. Au-delà du rapport lui-même et de ce qu'il révèle, tant de la stratégie israélienne que de l'avenir qu'elle dessine, nous avons interrogé Eyal Weizman sur l'histoire longue de Gaza et sur la place que cette région de la Palestine occupe dans le déploiement et les transformations du projet sioniste. Par ailleurs, Eyal Weizman est aussi revenu sur les rapports troublants entre le sort réservé aux Gazaouis et deux autres campagnes visant à saper les conditions d'existence d'un peuple et sur lesquelles Forensic Architecture a enquêté. L'un est le génocide perpétré par l'armée coloniale allemande contre les Namas et les Ova Hereros de Namibie au tournant du XXe siècle. L'autre est celui des Maya Ixil du Guatemala, sous la dictature du général Rios Montt et du chef d'état-major Benedicto Lucas Garcia entre 1978 et 1983. Notre conversation s'est achevée sur l'évocation du futur proche, que laisse entrevoir la prise de fonction de l'administration Trump, la criminalisation du soutien à la Palestine, ainsi que les risques croissants auxquels s'exposent les populations affectées par la violence d'État lorsqu'elles diffusent des informations sur ce qui leur arrive. Notre entretien avec Eyal Weizman a eu lieu à Paris le 26 janvier 2025.
So in October 2024, Forensic Architecture, your office, published this major report called Cartography of a Genocide, Israel's Conduct in Gaza since October 2023. And this report, which is major both in its finding and its size, since it's 827 pages, I think, is both informed by the work that your offices and you have been doing since the early 2000s, but it also departs from it in some major way. So in order to assess the departures, I think we should start with a recap briefly on what is forensic architecture, what does it do, its methodology, its ethical protocols, and its purposes. So let's start with that.
Yeah. So the kind of prehistory of forensic architecture is a project I was undertaking, a mapping project that I was undertaking together with B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights organization, in the occupied West Bank in the first years of the 2000s, during the time of the Intifada.
The second Intifada.
The second Intifada has just began. And Edward Said has published this article in the LRB calling for a counter-cartography of Palestine and lamenting the fact that, in fact, the Israelis control both the territory and its representation. It called for a kind of cartographic turn, and something like that inspired very much a group of, us young activist architects, and we started mapping out the crimes committed on the drawing board, meaning the design aspect, the planning of the settlements. There wasn't a map at the time. We had to travel through the West Bank, which was, kind of an area undergoing quite intense confrontations, in order to understand the way in which architecture and planning has been mobilized as strategic tools. And we thought if the crime of the occupation is perpetrated through architecture, that architectural techniques would help expose it. And out of that came a report that tried to our understanding, for the first time, to incriminate architects in human rights violations. So you'd think about the people that normally are considered to be the perpetrators of human rights violation being military personnel, politicians, police forces sometimes. And here crimes or human rights violation and war crimes were committed on the drawing board in the way lines were drawn, in the actual shape of settlements that were meant to cut apart, control the space, and create an unlivable zone for Palestinian, meaning all the arteries were actually chopped apart by the way in which the settlements were located, planned very much by architects that were previously military personnel. So they knew how to control space by cutting the arteries, taking the control points above, enveloping Palestinian-built fabric from all around, so that to constrain its possibility. And then later on, I started imagining when, and it was when that map and that report was one of the main evidence in the 2004 ICJ case against the wall. And ICJ being the International Court of Justice, where the court has actually ruled that the wall that Israel was building since 2002 within Palestinian territories was illegal and called for its demolition. Of course, it immediately got demolished. But that was, I was seeing that evidence being part of not only a legal process, but a legal process that was wrapped into a social movement and an anti-colonial project, because the failure to comply with the 2004 ICJ ruling is one of the starting point of the BDS, a movement for the boycott, disinvestment and sanction of Israel that has gained huge prominence within the conflict. And so again, I've learned two things out of that. One, that what we architects can draw and do can be taken, quote unquote, seriously by grown-ups in the international system, and then that cases need to be not confined to court, but part of a larger political movement. And that's how we've worked since. And then, you know, I had a chance, I got a grant from the ERC around 2010 and 2011 to actually formalize a kind of a sub-discipline of architecture that we called at the time forensic architecture. We did not really understand it immediately to be what it is today. It was originally understood to be, you know, kind of those type of territorial mapping and also an analysis of urban warfare that I was doing a lot of work on. More or less understanding the building as in an analogous way to the cadaver in, you know, forensic anthropology. You look at the building, you look at the traces or the ruin of the building and reconstruct, maybe also like an archaeologist, what are the forces, physical forces, blast or, you know, the blades of a bulldozer or gunfire that you can read from the material fact of the architecture. So we started developing modes of modeling and understanding cities undergoing urban warfare. And of course, at that time, in the early 2000s, in the first decade of the 21st century, cities became the targets of in a number of conflicts, you know, across the sort of neo-colonial frontiers of Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, and in these places. Then something happened, and we didn't understand it immediately, but we kind of fell upon a technique rather than design it, because in 2005, mapping became redundant with Google Earth and Google Maps starting to make satellite analysis more or less publicly available. Of course, not in a resolution that we have today, not in the frequency that we have today, but you didn't need to map. And a map became a photograph, right? And a satellite image, you know, as Laura Kurgan is showing in her book, also with own books, is an understanding of a photograph. You need to understand resolution and bandwidth and color and ground truth in order to understand what you see in a photograph taken from outer space. But it is primarily a photograph. And then other kind of images started emerging. And in those, I would say Palestine was again a kind of a laboratory of another kind of transformation. People think about Palestine as a laboratory of warfare and techniques of control and weapons and all those things that Israel later exports after practicing on Palestinians. But it was also in the West Bank at that time, in the first decade of the 21st century, that the kind of systematization of distribution of cameras and kind of video evidence, the collection and an analysis of what is seen in videos as evidence started to emerge with different projects, including Shooting Back, and you know, my friend Issa Amro and others were kind of promoting that kind of. Initially, you had to distribute cameras in Hebron, in other places, and later, you know, it became in everybody's pocket with smartphones, and the means to distribute it through social media became very readily available. And then the problem was not so much about those trophy videos, because you had those videos that in the same frame you see a perpetrator and you see a victim and you see an act, and that is very easily packaged and it could go on social media. And still today these go and become the viral images. But for every one of those that you have hundreds, if not thousands, of cases where you have fragments, where you have, you know, a video of something just before something occurs. In another video, you have the sound of a gunfire, but you don't see what happened. In another one, you see a car rushing. In the other one, an ambulance is coming. In yet another video, you see civilians running away from a place with white flag. In others, you have a videographer maybe coming a bit too late out of a window, filming onto the street and commenting upon what they're seeing at that moment. Meaning that to understand what you see in those images, a kind of an art of composition had to occur. And then, you know, in the sort of open source revolution, when those became readily available, it wasn't really about finding that one video, it was about composing. And in order to compose, you need to do two things, very technical. You need to geolocate and you need to synchronize the videos. You need to know which video came first, what is the order of time in the videos, and what each video is capturing in relation to the other. Meaning the way of looking at videos was not so much for what they show, but for hinges to others, right? So each image and each video became a gateway to see others. And what needed to develop is a kind of assemblages of videos. Sometimes 6 videos have to be composed, and in our biggest cases that came very early on, 700 videos had to be composed into a single case. And we realized that not the one way to do it, the only way to do it is via architectural models. And we had them ready, and we fell upon that technique. At the same time, Bellingcat was starting to geolocate in a very rudimentary manner, simply on satellite images with a kind of cones. But when you needed to understand things in a bit more complex way, you needed to build a 3D model, say, of a part of a city or a street. You needed to locate each camera within that model, and then each camera is moving, so you need to, kind of like model the movement of each camera. And you need to start studying not only what's in the frame, but what's outside of the frame, and what's the relation between one frame and the other. And only 3D models can do it. And we had that. We had the people to do it. And very, very fast it caught the attention of the people that were doing analysis. And the first cases were drone strikes in the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier, where we could actually start showing against the Obama denial that those were taking place, what was happening there. And at the time also, Bellingcat and Forensic Architecture were working very closely later, kind of not parted way, but we build the capacity. We were kind of complementary in our capacities. Bellingcat was very fast in hoovering in a lot of videos, doing the first sync and geolocation, and we were like slow into building the images into a studio. The kind of the architectural model was the optical device within which you could see, the only way in which you can understand the relation between things. But there was another ideological component to this project, and that was a certain kind of anarchic disruptor kind of joy at the time. We came out against, very, very clearly against, the traditional investigative journalism approach that the greatest investigative journalists are those that have connections in the halls of power, that know how to cultivate those connections, reward them, sometimes, do the kind of give and take that you need to do in order to keep your source happy, and then would get the kind of the file that would leak, or the deep throat that would give you the material about this massacre in Vietnam or somewhere else. And we said, we don't speak to anyone. In fact, the secret is already out there. And that's a different conception of secrecy. It's not that there is a wall between the domain of the secret and the domain of the public, but every secret policy leaves traces in the visible world, and it exists as videos, or as receipts, or as flight paths that exist, and this is how also the extraordinary rendition policy, the most secret policy at the time of the CIA, was exposed by amateurs that could just connect fragments, like the evidentiary flotsam that, this receipt with this photograph, and this photograph with this flight path, and finally you had the kind of the assemblages of images that came from open source, and it became an ideology of kind of like, we do journalism and we do human rights differently. So it disrupted the field of investigative journalism, but it also disrupted the field of human rights, because human rights still in the early 2000s was very much based on a very empathetic interviewers who coming after the fact into a place and ask you, well, what did you experience, and take notes in a paper and reproduce your testimony, and there become the conduit for testimony. And in a sense, we thought this is redundant, because the testimonies are already given live. And also human rights field was part of human rights, was part of the humanities. No, it wasn't a kind of a scientific practice, although it had some, you know, it was kind of starting to be interested in all sort of scientific investigations, etc. Human rights traditionally were those kind of empathetic, liberal left-wing people who were going to places and taking the testimony, and it was about the testimony, the direct testimony of victims that need to be mobilized against the scientific, technological, repressive power of states. So there was an ideology that kind of grounded those testimonies. And for us, we decided to refuse that distinction between evidence and testimony, between the misanthropic scientist and the heartfelt humanist. And in fact, everything that we were doing was kind of blaring that. We say a video that is taken by somebody who experienced firsthand a community at the forefront of conflict is both a testimony and a piece of evidence. In fact, we were looking at, very recently, we were decided to look again at many of our videos, and we made an experiment in the office. We said, okay, let's not look at the images. Let's turn the camera off, but just listen to the audio of those videos that were taken by users. And interestingly enough, all of them, almost every person that records a video in real time leaves an audio signature on that. Sometimes they cry, sometimes they shout, sometimes they curse, sometimes they pray, sometimes they try to intervene, sometimes they narrate very clearly, sometimes they narrate very passionately, but there's always a trace of the subjectivity of the experience of the person that is encoded over the image that shows the, you know, the materiality and the physicality of what is happening. And so you have evidence and testimony intertwined in that video, and we treated them as an entangled thing. So when we call us a forensic architecture, it's not that we refuse this sort of testimonial, humanistic, you know, heartfelt approach. We had that. We felt very, very, very close to the witnesses, but we always combine the scientific and the testimonial. And then, so, you know, it was also a transformation of human rights that delivered the first agency of collection to the communities at the forefront of struggle. And rather than a kind of a process of mediation, started into a process of collaboration.
There's three stages, even though I'm not sure how they fit chronologically. But the first two, definitely. The beginning of forensic architecture is, in a way, doing human rights activism based on traces rather than testimonies. That's the very beginning. Then after that, you reincorporate, in one way, testimonies by making testimonies part of not something that you report on, but something that is part of the construction of the evidence, and hence, as you just explained, the closer contact with the people that actually took these open source videos. But then there's a third technique that you developed, which you call situated testimonies, which is another way of dealing with testimonies, and this time the traces that you look at are not traces on the ground or traces on the ground mediated by cameras, but in this case you explore the memory themselves. So if you can talk a little bit about the situation.
Absolutely. So firstly, I just want to kind of like return, because you mentioned that, and I think, I don't know if the viewers know that this debate existed within human rights between the humanists and the scientists, you know, and we wanted to refuse that. And it wasn't only about what we know, it's about also who gets to tell a story. And, you know, the humanists were saying, well, if you do remote sensing human rights, you silence the survivors or the victims. And those that were doing the science was saying, well, you know, how is that building up to a complete picture? And for us, it was really about opening the conversation, meaning listening to the testimonies of matter, if you like, in looking at material trace, looking at videographic trace, at recorded trace, and at human voice, together, amplifying it and building a kind of a, human non-human, assemblage that kind of, create and build those things together. And everything that we were doing was about amplifying evidence. And before I'll go into the situated testimony, I'd say that whereas in court, what is the best kind of evidence is a simple evidence. The less composed it is, the better it is. That single image, photograph, or a video of a perpetrator and a victim in the frame, and the act is all contained within the frame, is best because it's simple. But for us, evidence becomes stronger the more threads are building into the fabric. This is what reinforces, one evidence reinforces the other. Of course, when you present complex evidentiary assemblages in legal context, they all cry foul. No, they say, no, here's the manipulation is coming, and you're only artists and architects, and I don't know what you do. You kind of trick us on the card trick. It's a card trick, no? And so that is the issue. And the same goes to testimony. So testimony should also not be contaminated, and memory should not be contaminated as a principle of law and also of human rights. And if you take, this is why the more times you take the same testimony from a person, it's, the further away from supposedly the authentic memory it comes, and you start remembering your own testimony, and etc. For us, language is only one and pretty reduced way of penetrating the totality of experience that people had, which includes sound, and includes space, and it includes not only space, the ambient of that space. And particularly this is important when witnesses to extreme acts of violence are traumatized. And traumatized might be a kind of a clinical definition that has thresholds, but almost everybody that you speak to who has experienced violence is affected by it, and the effect also goes to memory itself. And the closer you get, people can tell you very precisely what happened before and what happened after, but the heart of the testimony, and that's sometimes what is important to narrate, is actually erased by, kind of trauma's effect on memory. And one of the ways of engaging that is through a very systematic, very slow and careful, and also together with well-being expert or family members of the person that is doing the recollection, a very slow process of model building of the space, in which we don't ask anything immediately about what has happened, and everything about tiles, the temperature, the height of the ceiling, the amount of light, the handles, things that are very material, and build them very, very slowly. And we've realized that very often memories spring with the most unexpected of digital objects that are being put into place. And in this book, I narrate the encounter with a woman that survived the drone strike. She prefers to remain anonymous. She actually forgot what has happened, but she wanted to deliver testimony, and she was willing to undergo that process. And only when we modeled a certain fan that in her house in Mir Ali on a frontier between Pakistan and Afghanistan was targeted by drones, only when modeling the fan was she able to recall that she has seen human flesh on it after the drone missile hit the house. And coming to terms with that and having that model in place allowed around that fan, the entire event and space could be reconstructed. Same with survivors of the Grenfell tragedy in London. who we were working on a civil suit, and we reconstructed.
Can you tell us very briefly what it
2017, 72 people in the center of London, in full view of everybody in London, burned to death in a housing block. After it was cladded for aesthetic reason, these flammable materials. Despite the company that put this flammable material, knowing that these are flammable material, somebody thought it looks good, and effectively it caught fire, and 22 floors. There were hundreds of people in the building. In order to survive, you needed to go through the stairwell, and the stairwell was full of smoke, and that was London hell. And I remember the day after, I mean, we just couldn't believe it. I mean, everybody was, you were seeing that smoked building with a cloud going into high heaven in front of all of us, shocked that something like that could happen and could be a result of the kind of relaxation of planning codes and an amplification of aesthetic codes in one of the most richest boroughs in the world, Kensington and Chelsea. But there was a bigger civil suit, and as part of it, we were asked to record the testimonies of people. The flats are gone, but we were building the flats one after the other, you know, object by object, book by book, plant by plant, and trying to understand also, so that was important in itself, but all those objects were also memory anchors. It was like, you know, the art of memory in the sort of digital age, if you like.
And the most extraordinary example of that is what you did in the Syrian prison of Sandaia, that you also reconstructed based on the memories of the prisoners who managed to escape. This prison that has been recently uncovered in full with the fall of the Assad regime.
Yeah, absolutely. There we met 5 survivors who were in Turkey as refugees who wanted to record their experience. They haven't seen the building because they were thrown into a car blindfolded. They were blindfolded or had to press their hands against their eyes. When they were inside, they only heard the building. And they counted, sometimes some of them counted footsteps, and some of them paid attention to the echo and reverberation. And together with Lawrence Abu Hamdan, a former PhD student who now runs an organization called Earshot, we reconstructed from their audio recollection the architecture of the building, which was, and produced the only model of that building, because here you have no photographs. And sometimes the situated testimony comes to replace the absence of photographs. But just like photograph, memory is also perspectival. No? I mean, it belongs to the person, but situated in a particular space-time. And for a long time, that was the reference, because this was the only model of Sandaia, of the way it was organized inside. And incredibly, when it was liberated this fall, initially what happened was hundreds of people from Syria were tagging us, writing us, you know, direct messaging us on Instagram or X, to say, you know the building better than anyone else. They're still, our loved one are still in the basement somewhere. Where's the basement? Where's the basement? And when we were saying, actually we don't know, because the witnesses that we were interviewed were not at any basement in there, or at least they did not record that. There was anger that was actually, and we decided just to put all our material on open, actually the files, the architectural files, because we had the platform, we had a kind of like a polished version of that online, but we put a digital model online, and that digital model is a reproduction of a huge prison with tens of thousands of prisoners in it, like the real kind of current day concentration / death camp in Syria. That was out, and it was proven that the witnesses remembered correctly, because it was almost precisely what was discovered when the place was stormed and liberated. There was no, I never felt joy like at that moment, actually, when this was there, and also for our witnesses that, I can talk at a different time about our interaction with them later, but like the validation of their recollection, and how precise recollection that were, from fragments of evidence could have been. But yes, you're right that here you have also, is architecture in situated testimony, the model that you walk through, is this an evidence, or is that is a testimony? It is a piece of evidence that enabled testimony. Testimony and evidence are again entangled, and we're doing similar work now with descendants of genocide survivors in today's Namibia. We'll get to that, but using that principle of situated testimony of inherited memories. And we're doing it in two different ways. It's not a single recollection, it's a communal reconstruction, and it's not direct recollection, it is recollection of recollection of recollection.
So before we move to the cartography of a genocide, the forums in which your work is shown include courts, but also media, but also art exhibit, art museum, wherever it can be public. So it's your notion of the forum as linked to forensics and forensic architecture, but also, and that's important as a transition towards the next question, usually your ethical protocols are that you don't work for government, you don't you work against, or you try to provide evidence about state crimes. And you also don't usually take the initiative. In other words, you wait to be commissioned by people who have been affected by that, right? So just to...
Okay, these are two separate questions. Each one of them is requires, a lengthy, but I'll try to be brief. Firstly, it came out, our analysis of the place of law and human rights in politics is exactly to open it up, socialize evidence production, and socialize the evidence distribution, right? And it's difficult because if you collaborate with a community, and if you say in advance, yes, we're committed to Palestine liberation, to decolonization, in the way that we understand it to be, kind of freedom for all between the river and the sea, you are, they often tell you, sorry, if you're an activist, just go to the street. This is a place for serious deliberation of neutral, observance. And then often we would say, and the lawyers for the other side, for the military, are they exactly those kind of like 19th century objective scientists? No, let the evidence play. But also, it is about the way in which evidence and human rights, in as much as anything is worth in that discourse, is to be linked to political initiatives. So when we take a case, our first analysis is, is it the case for us? Is architecture could help there? Do we know how to do it? If we do know how to do it, we don't take it. We always say we don't take cases we know how to resolve, because we're also a university. Forensic architects sit at Goldsmiths, and now we have also our responsibility as academics to do something new every time, and to open the field and then to disseminate the technique. So that's part of our mandate. But the third question, then another question that we have we been asked to do it? Or just we go into something because we think it's interesting? And it's not that we've never done that in the beginning, but we learn not to do it. Because you don't enter the site of somebody's trauma uninvited. And if you do not, if you are invited, that is a beginning of a form of relationship that is close, that is collaborative, where we are not a remote expert, but we are all experts. No, there are the experts that understand things like the prisoners of Sadnaya. They're expert listeners, or the expert recollectors. You know, like in Namibia, no, people that can conserve the memory and transfer it on with the expert in some kind of IT thing. So we are like the IT department of that of this sort of social and political movement. That's really important, to enter a place welcomed and collaborative, not to say, oh, sorry, can we run between your leg and do that, and who are you and why are you doing that and what's your interest in that. So we learned not to do it, but the problem with that, no, I mean, okay, so we kept on receiving, you know, requests from Palestine, where we were very well known, from Mexico, where we were well known, in Colombia, where we did the Truth Commission, and in other places where we were known. But I don't know, we didn't get requests from India or from places where we are less known, or people who are not as well connected to this kind of global human rights media discourse. Etc. So we, you know, this is also a certain bias that enters into that. So we found ways to become present without entering when we think that there would be a need for our work. But that analysis of the case needs to be political, needs to be aligned with social movement, liberation movement, or political movement, means that the case cannot be surrendered to the court itself, because every like you said, no, forensics, we want to, you know, kind of liberate forensics from the telescoping that the term has undergone in simply the presentation of science in court, and to say forensics in the way it was understood by the great orators of the first century is the art of the forum. That's what forensics means, and forum can be multiple things. It's a public space also. So making evidence public, no, to kind of take a Latourian-like formulation. And in order for it to be political. And but each forum constrains the speech, the evidentiary speech in one way. Still, you know, in court you need to follow certain protocols, and it's not the place maybe always to speak about the long history or the political context of things. But you can do it in the media maybe, but in the media you have to do it short. But you can do that in a larger human rights report. You can do it in a truth commission, things that are exactly designed to be historical, like our work for the Colombian Truth Commission, which spans, you know, decades. It's exactly about the long duration of conflict. And in a gallery, you know, you can do other things. You can, for example, present conceptual problems or questions that come from media and representation, and speak about that. You could amplify a message by putting it in a sort of court of public opinion in that way. You could benefit from the money that the art world is putting into, and now it's much less because we became too controversial for the art world after a number of controversies we've done, including once when we went to the Whitney Museum in the context of the Whitney Biennale and decided to investigate the deputy president of the board for how he got the money with which we did that project, and showed his you know, kind of exposed, it was known, but aspects of his tear gas business and selling sniping bullets to the Israeli army. So, you know, you kind of use the white cube not to reflect on politics elsewhere, but we wanted to explode it. No, we wanted to kind of tear the very museum that gives us this forum apart. And in fact, this principle of presenting evidence in the forum is always an attempt to transform it has been a kind of a principle for us. If we engage with journalism, yes, we criticize the way in which traditional investigative journalism was undertaken. If we exist in the human rights world, yes, we kind of work differently between the evidence testimony paradigm. If we are in the art, yeah, we are not kind of agreeing to this diagram that, you know, radical political art, which you can see everywhere in museums, as long as it's non-consequential, right? So you can see, you can have exhibitions about the Situationists, and it's kind of quaint and nice and wonderful, and the museum can actually tolerate it because it's not going to actually lead to the firing of the resignation, as happened at the Whitney, of the deputy person of the board. So each forum allow a different facet of evidence to play, allows you to connect to different, to socialize it differently, politicize it differently, and each one offsets the limitation of speech that exists in others. So we say each one of the forums is compromised. There's nothing like a perfect. It's not like we refuse this and go there. We do all the forums because in each one, you know, there's limitations and possibilities, and that allows things to happen, which means that we in all compromised forums and, you know, been criticized rightly for why you're representing in court. The court is actually a bureaucratic mechanism that is just, you know, made by the state for the state, and you just give legitimacy to a legal system that need to be discarded in a revolutionary manner. Why are you showing in the art? You're just enjoying the this, or human rights is a kind of liberal, softy kind of practice, etc. But we think that just like this multiplicity, the radical multiplicity in which our work, the spaces it occupies, offset, and this is really where the kind of potential, the transformative potential, if it exists there.
So in that, now the transition to the next step, despite the fact that there's a multiplicity of angles and a multiplicity of intervention that you had before, the recent report that you published in October about what's been happening in Gaza since October 23 is a departure, I would say, in two ways. One major way is that this time it was not commissioned by anyone, it was self-initiated. That was something new, at least totally new, or a radical novelty. I mean, you had sort of finagled that before, but this one was clearly self-initiated. And then the other thing is that the basis of human rights activism, to the extent that you still belong to it, is that it's usually you use an incident as a synecdoche, as a part for the whole of a whole situation. So what you explore is an incident, and to show that a crime was committed there, but then that crime can be used to sort of illustrate, expose a larger situation. In this case, you sort of turn things around. It was not about exploring one incident, but exploring a huge multiplicity of incident in order to prove that, in fact, a genocide was happening. So the two questions would be, first, why, and how, and under what condition did you decide to sort of self-initiate that project? And also, when did you do it? I mean, when did you decide, when, after not only October 7, but the beginning of the Israeli campaign, when was the turning point? Because I think you started off by doing your usual work, so to speak, by exploring what had happened at the Al-Hali hospital. But then you moved from that to doing this cartography. So why and when is the question.
So it really happened after our legal, political, historical analysis that we've undertaken at the beginning throughout the months of October and November 2023, And it took us time. I mean, Rad Segal on the 13th of October says this is a text case.
Rad Segal is
an Israeli Holocaust scholar. Comes out with a very influential article, said a textbook case for genocide.
On the 13th of October,
on
right?
the 13th of October. We took a little longer, but not much longer, definitely not as long as Amnesty and Human Rights Watch or others, because we needed to kind of like understand what situation we are in. And by November, our analysis was that yes, this is what we are witnessing is a genocidal campaign against Palestinians. And that means that who should commission that? Who's here the target of this genocide? And who is it that we should be in contact exactly with? Now we have several brilliant Palestinian researchers in forensic architecture. We have our partner in Al-Haq, which is the first and biggest Palestinian human rights group that has been also they've been designated as a terrorist organization by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, but 4 years ago now. And but they are our partners, and there is a forensic architecture office in Ramallah with Al-Haq. We have together decided that what we're seeing is genocide. We need to stop it, and that even though we were in contact with people on the ground, and in the early days more, we were having phone calls. We were speaking to people. We also had a partner organization in Gaza called Ein Media, which has done all our project in Gaza were undertake a collaboration with Ein Media. The very first thing that we've done was not Al Ahli. In the first week, we were looking for partners. We were looking for friends. People were looking for them on the ground, and we were looking for them amongst hundreds of videos that we could see until we've learned something that we haven't yet put out. And then on the 22nd of October, the director of this organization, Rushdie al-Sarraj, who is the son of the Gaza's mayor, went to his father's home thinking it's safe and not understanding the transformation that was going on. And of course, his father's house was targeted, and he was murdered in there, protecting, lying on his daughter and his wife. So this is the first thing that we were doing, was not even in the field of human rights, was just effectively looking for friends and partners. We were all gutted, we were disoriented, we were in enormous pain and shock. And then slowly we have also decided that just being in contact with people, journalists are being targeted, people that were uploading things were being targeted. We thought it's too dangerous to actually take testimonies that are not already out in the public domain. So we did two things. One is that we understood that in this genocide, physicians, doctors, medical professionals are the witnesses, and that we would talk to, because they were going in and out. And a lot of physicians, before going to Gaza, were stopping by forensic architecture office and asking us, how do we collect evidence? And we did several kind of training sessions. We talked about it, and they were sending us things when they came out, and we were talking about, keeping the camera on, recording the audio, and rather than going with the camera to train the camera on things, just keep the audio on. We can do a lot with the audio. Just keep it on. It's also not so much data, and pragmatically it was much better. And it allows us to sync because of the audio signature of blasts, effectively, with different events. And the hospitals were at the center. The hospitals were being targeted, and physicians were being survivors, effectively. it was interesting because a lot of our work in conceptualization of the politicization of testimony came from kind of an older work that I've done for the least of all possible evil, and with our common friend Ronnie Brauman on medical testimony and the way in which medical testimony, particularly here in France with Doctors Without Borders, was kind of the hinge of a certain transformation in the human rights movement, in which physicians were not being neutral. Then it was kind of like put in more nuance, but that really inspired us also to kind of be engaged witnesses rather than neutral forensics, like the non-neutral French doctors, French humanitarians. It was very important for us, kind of like understanding and mining that history of the 1980s where those decisions were made and those debates were made, and the kind of the critique of the neutrality of the ICRC, the Red Cross, towards an engaged humanitarianism that reports on what they see, that kind of takes sides more or less. Here we had another level to that, because physicians in Gaza were all targets. The hospitals were targets. The hospitals were also some kind of temporary refugee camps, and so they became central nervous system, because people came from all over Gaza. When Gaza was under the most intense bombardment in the history of aerial warfare, people crowded to the hospital thinking that Israel will not bomb the hospitals. But when they came to the hospital, that people from Zaytun can hear what happened in Jabalia, and people from Jabalia would hear what happened in Rimal, etc. All the stories were kind of syncing up, and the scale of atrocities were becoming clear in the hospitals and also to the doctors, who became secondary witnesses to the recollection of their patients. So doctors were survivors, they were direct eyewitnesses, they were expert witnesses because they could read in the wounds the kind of munition, or in the blood the kind of malnutrition that was imposed on people in Gaza. And we started working with physicians, and particularly with one very admirable, very special person called Dr. Hassan Abu Sita, whose family is actually Palestinian refugees from the area that has become what's called Israel called the Gaza envelope, the area just outside the Gaza Strip, and worked with him on Al-Ahli and on other hospitals. So two things happened. No? We knew we couldn't speak directly to witnesses. We started speaking to doctors. Hospitals became important. And we couldn't wait for like a commission when the targeted group is a nation. And what we've done is we started collecting evidence in a way that was kind of started totally manic. Every video that was uploaded that existed, either online or in Al Jazeera, or by that time we were pretty well known also in Gaza and across Palestine, so people were sending us directly videos. Each video that we were seeing went into a database. Each one went through a process. Each one was verified. Then it was geolocated, timed, and a description of what is in it. And we started collecting thousands and thousands and thousands of those videos, each one showing a different aspect of a thing. And of course that when your analysis of what you're experiencing is genocide, unlike in human rights violation cases or war crime cases, is not incident-based. When
it's a notion of patterns, which is crucial to you.
Yeah, so in, a war crime is a bombing of a place where it's not, if it's not a military site, no? This is the category of distinction. Under the category of proportionality, an incident analysis would say, oh, are there too many? It was too many, no? That kind of lesser evil argument, no? Are too many civilians being killed in relation to the significance of that target. So that is the traditional human rights and international humanitarian law war crime analysis. In genocide, you need to look at what it all adds up to. All those atrocities that are happening, do they add up to an image of a designed campaign for destruction under the special intent that genocide requires, the intent to destroy people in whole or in part, or any protected group in whole or in part? And the way to understand it is not really to just look at the evidence, but at relation between evidence. So, in fact, it's become a meta process. It's evidence about evidence. And you need to collect enormous amount of data points, but it's not each data point which matters, is whether a destruction of a field in Gaza is related to a destruction of a aid convoy happening at the same time, at the same space, joining together to aggravate famine. And this is what we were doing, collecting, classifying, and then, of course, the work, we were publishing it, and the amazing legal team of South Africa that already in December was putting up a petition to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, for provisionary measures, which is the only way you can do it, is if you prove that a genocide is possibly happening, that then the court would take your claim, because then when the genocide is happening, the court need to assemble very fast and render its judgment. And by January, on the 11th and 12th of January, they were presenting their case in clear, and it was amazing. I think for everybody missed a heartbeat when they saw the South Africa team presenting in a kind of perfect legal idiom that charge of genocide against Israel, and doing that from the perspective and a position of a country in the global south that experienced settler colonialism, that experienced genocide, but refuses to singularize their experience and look at kind of, in fact, having experienced that, give them the platform, perhaps the right, to bring that against not only Israel, it felt, but all its supporters in Europe and the US that were defending it both morally and, more importantly, materially, and supplying it.
So though your project was self-initiated, you were eventually contacted by the South African
yes, and they and they've used the material was produced in particular form at their request, as evidence for them to use in multiple stages throughout that process, throughout the legal process, and it needed to be kind of understood and strategized in relation to what genocide is.
So proving genocide is about proving intent. In order to prove intent, you need to find patterns. And when one reads your report, one can see two different types of patterns. One has to do with repetition, a repetition of the same type of act of violence, repetition in time and in different places, but also complementarity. In other words, one type of violence sort of resonates with another in order to make the intent even more visible. So if you can just quickly rehash these two or develop these two forms of repetition, patterns.
So, with genocide, obviously, this is the kind of the most famous thing about the definition of genocide as a crime, is that it's not only based on facts on the ground. It's facts on the ground, and you need the guilty mind, you need the guilty intent, you need to do that with the special intent, which is the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And usually, génocidaires, I don't say usually because, you have exception to that, but you have cases where the génocidaires try to hide the fact that this is what they're doing. They don't advertise it publicly. Here, Israel has gone through a manic state of a genocidal mindset that was unleashed immediately in the first hours after October 7th, the Hamas-led attack on the envelope in October 7th, in which you have declaration by military personnel, by people in charge of the military, the Minister of Defense, the Israeli president, the prime minister, soldiers on the ground, officers, all the way up and down the command chain are going to genocide. You know? And they, particularly the kind of the leitmotif, the sort of the term that echoes throughout is the Amalekites, which is interesting. Because and I'll tell you why I think it's interesting. So firstly, who are the Amalekites? I mean, the Amalekites are kind of an ancient people that lived in the northern Sinai, southern Negev area, along the kind of coastal trade route between the Nile and the Euphrates area, along the Roman later called the Via Maris. They're semi-nomadic people, an episode in the Bible have the Exodus moving, through the territory and confrontation with the Amalekite, and then the command, the biblical command is remember what Amalek did to you, and it folded into the remember is the answer. What the remembrance need to do is that erase the memory of Amalek. No, so remember to erase memory, and so it's a trigger, it's a whistle. Now, when you say remember what Amalek did to you, it is everybody understands it as erase the memory of Amalek. And you have that, and that appears that's tagged to images, and it appears as graffiti on ruins of Gaza, and it's becomes somehow the rhetorical kind of trope of this genocide. So you have that, the kind of the special intent is established on the declaration level, and you have, the prime minister says Amalek. We're looking at on X now that the use of Amalek is peaking among soldiers that are, talking about not only soldiers in active duty, but the Israeli society. It appears on the ruins. We have done to Amalek. We are erasing the memory of Amalek, and go all the way down to the individual soldiers in it. So this is one level of intent that is established. Another level that is good to have when you run a case is when the génocidaires, the people that perpetrate genocide, are losing the war. You often have access to their archives. Like you had access, the Nuremberg trial, though it's not litigating genocide, had access to the Nazi archives and commands going all the way down, reporting going all the way up. Do something, we have done that something. That is the kind of the gold standard of genocide. Now, you don't have that. Israel has not been defeated. The army is there. The archive is in their hands. And they will not give you access to that. In fact, they are saying what we are telling each other is that we need to save Palestinians. You say that we are committing genocide, but actually we are warning them. We are providing some smattering of humanitarian aid here and there, etc. So then, recognizing that the special intent cannot be, evidence for that cannot be derived from still active militaries that have not been defeated, international jurisprudence usually allows for patterns to actually evidence the intent. What does it mean? It means that if Unit 1, say Golani, which is an infantry unit in the Israeli army, provides certain kind of atrocities in northern Gaza in October and November, or in November and December 2003, And another unit, say Givati, another infantry battalion, is doing the same in Rafah in May and June, and the paratroopers are doing that in another time, in another space. This is a pattern of action that, because they repeat across the battlefield by different units at different time, you can deduce from that that there is either a command or a policy that is promoted silently that demand that, right? So it's not each action in itself. The actions, the imminent action on the ground, testify for a higher order that is invisible. And then you're looking at different orders of patterns, and in statistics you have different orders. Well, you have the immediate patterns, no, like let's say every school or an hospital within a domain of a particular unit is being targeted in a particular way by following a certain kind of actions, and then you start looking at the relation between, you know, one type of destruction and another. So, you know, when throughout the genocide, you had a lot of reports, you know, the World Health Organization is tracking hospital, and other organizations are tracking, you know, the destruction of agriculture, and other organization of aid, and other organization, I don't know, of schools. And then you have all this proliferation of term of scholasticide, of people that track schools because they're seeing that massive destruction, and domicide, those that track, you know, the destruction of homes, etc. But what do the genocide exists in the relation between those different patterns. So when you see, you would expect that if the Israeli defense the destruction is a consequence of contingency, meaning there was resistance from a particular area, and therefore we had to demolish it legally because there were armed personnel in that particular area. But then you would see, you know, a kind of random distribution of data point across the map surface. What you see, unlike that, is that all data points align. Meaning when they destroy agricultural fields, it is actually part of a larger designed plan, which is to bisect the Gaza Strip into separate areas, and we'll talk about what happened in those separate areas. And in a clear geometric pattern in space, and in time, that agricultural destruction happened at the same time that attacks on aids are unfolding in a completely different part of Gaza. And you know, attack on agriculture is an attack on the ability of society to feed itself. Attack on aid is the ability of, you know, international donor to feed them from the outside. When you don't have your own fields and food does not coming in, that aggravates famine in a particular way, or create famine, or engineers famine. When you don't allow journalists in and you attack journalists inside. These are ways in which those patterns start speak to each other, mathematically, if you like, across the battlefield. But you know, each one, I remind you that each one of those patterns that, you know, kind of lead to this matter is like behind it there's a video or a testimony. There is a voice memo that is sent to us, or videos that is sent to us. Each one of them is a heartbreaking testimony, like that of Hind Rajab, a child that is driven with a family to evacuate when and how the Israeli army instructed to evacuate, and is murdered in a car, and the ambulance that is sent towards her is also attacked, and the medics are killed. Each one of those points is a story that is actually also human story that humanize, and all of them are speaking about ending the genocide.
So, still this pattern, but moving to another kind of pattern. The patterns that you've observed in Gaza reminded you of two other cases that you've investigated, very different cases, apparently, but with similar pattern. One was in Guatemala, the other one in Namibia. So let's briefly remind ourselves what you saw first in Guatemala.
So firstly, just to say that although the majority of our work during the genocide in Gaza was on Gaza, we have not stopped working on other places. And we had ongoing work in different places, including Namibia, where I was, and I was asked also to deliver expert testimony in the genocide trial of Lucas Garcia, who was the head of the Guatemalan army at the turn of the 80s, 1979 to 1982, where a genocidal campaign against the Ixil Maya people, Maya-speaking people that are living on the highlands of Guatemala. And this was one of the first cases that forensic architecture did, because I got into that case through an interview with one of the greatest human rights forensic person, Clyde Snow, who was doing human rights exhumation there, or exhumation for proving the genocide, reading the genocide on the bodies that. And he asked me at the time, it was back in 2011, I think, to go to Guatemala and to look at the architectural dimension of that genocide. And of course, the Guatemalan military under Lucas Garcia and then Rios Montt destroyed about 400 Ixil Maya villages, deforested huge part of the land, and concentrated the survivors in model villages on the valley under government control. And what our task at the time was actually to firstly find out and map where the villages were. And of course, you know, villages that were razed and burned, you know, 40 years later, the forest, the cloud forest, is actually regrown on the ruins, and you actually go through very thick forest and you don't know exactly where the village is. Sometimes you need to follow the trees because a higher density of particular type of papaya or avocado would designate a space that might have been inhabited, or you see an area where the forest seems a bit younger than around, and obviously it's secondary growth forest on the clearing. The villages were in forest clearing, and then you can limit your research, and then you take sticks, you stick it into the ground until you find the foundation. Every organic matter of that building has been consumed by the forest. But slowly, we reconstruct the villages, count the number of buildings, understand the logic of distribution, work together with Mayan communities on what was the form of life that existed there, which is a kind of liminal type of agriculture in which things are cultivated within forest. They are not an orchard versus the forest, but slightly more things that you need are existing in the forest next to you, or even small clearings within the forest you can grow maize in, etc. So there was that kind of continuity that was sustaining the life of the Ixil Maya people, not only their biological life, but also the cultural and religious life. And of course, the genocide involves direct killing of Maya people and mass graves and horrible atrocities. But effectively, a lot of it was done through the environment. The forest was burned. The relationship between the forest, field, and homestead and village were actually demolished. That was the foundation of life for the Ixil Maya people. And then some people resisted and went and lived on the mountain where they were starved. So went higher on the mountain. They had not enough nutrition. They died of starvation and disease in these extermination areas. And those that complied went down into the valley. It had a clear vertical dimension, went down to the valley into some kind of something that is like reservation, where people from a whole lot of area were concentrated in small area and developed there to integrate into the national economy. We were taught to cultivate particular type of species, very much reduced, etc. So that was something that, you know, without making like direct analogy, no, I mean the valley and the hill, North Gaza, which was completely ordered to evacuate, South Gaza, which was the area where some kind of limited version of humanitarian aid was allowed to enter. I thought that that is the architecture of genocide is based on those, on this kind of, you know, evacuation area and destination area and annihilation area that were very clearly seen in the architecture in Guatemala. We were also working in Namibia at the time. Of course, the German colonial genocide against the Nama and Over-Herero people that, okay, exactly when it began, there's, you know, contestation and debate about, but at early years, I mean, for the Herero, the kind of the understanding is 1904 to 1908. German settler colonialism escalates into genocide based on an insurgency. By the way, also in Guatemala, the left-wing insurgency was also had some bases in the remote mountains of the Ixil Maya, so that the settler colonial state takes the humiliated defeats, initial defeats, into a genocidal rage and implementation of that kind of form of destruction, which in the case of the Over-Herero in the fall of 1904, with a clear extermination order against the Herero, and then and the genocide, of course, involved also direct killing, poisoning, and hanging of Herero people. But the majority of killing is done by the environment. The relationship, the Herero livelihood and form of life is grounded in the more or less fertile valley around Windhoek and Okahanja, in the relation between certain kind of grass, bushes, and cattle. The cattle are being destroyed, and the people are expelled beyond the line of water divide into a more arid area, and the environment does the killing. And again, you have that, and then, you know, when the extermination order is revoked, people are concentrated, collected from large landscape and concentrated in concentration area, concentration camp, where they still suffer kind of abuse, forced labor, rape, execution, but the genocide takes another shape at that moment. And yeah, so you start seeing those relations between you know, another settler colonial genocide in Palestine erupting around the rage of a military defeat, leading to expulsion into concentration areas, and the demolition of the conditions of life that ground those people in place.
So that poses both a methodological question and also opens to the definition about a certain type of violence. The methodological question is the following, is that what seems to be the logic of these three cases is a logic that is based on cleansing. The idea is to push a population away, aside, at worst destroying it for good, but at least expelling it. So that's one element. And the other element is that it is triggered, at least the most intense phase is triggered by a certain form of insurgency, which means that people who deny that these are genocides will say two things. Will say, no, it was not a genocide, it was counterinsurgencies. And when you have counterinsurgency, well, bad things happen because it's a struggle, it's a war. on the one hand. And on the other hand, in the Genocide Convention, ethnic cleansing is not part of it. Lemkin apparently wanted to have it in, but finally in the convention it's not there. So you can say, even if you want to expel people, it's bad to expel people, but it cannot be called genocide. So one has to work with that, and working with that is, I think, what enables one in general to define a very specific type of violence, which is settler colonialism genocide, and that implies first finding the kind of regime of violence that is, which I think we can discuss, that is based on the notion that was in fact implemented and discovered first time around the genocide of the Nama and the Ovaherero, which is the notion of Lebensraum. So that's a certain type of regime, but also you have to show that this kind of violence falls into the category of genocide, and that means working on the text of the convention.
Mm. So we spoke about the special intent. Under the special intent, and given the special intent, there are several prohibited crimes. The most famous and the most effective of is a prohibition on killing the people, the prohibition on creating bodily harm, of preventing birth. And these are direct acts of violence. The perpetrator is close to or directly affects the victim of the genocide with the consequence of the act. But what has remained in the Genocide Convention and allows us to connect it in a clearest way to settler colonial genocide is the prohibition on inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part. And that term was really interesting for me and interesting for many people who were looking at what was happening in Gaza. Not that there was no killing and no bodily harm. There was plenty of that. We know about 50,000 Palestinians are recorded as dead and many more missing. There are bodily harm. There's upwards of close to 200,000 registered wounded, people we know are wounded. And I think everybody there has got a mental and physical crime, and prevention of birth without hospital is clear. But very explicitly to think through what does it mean, conditions of life calculated to bring about a destruction. And for us, it meant that the act of killing is not direct, but is mediated through an environment, the conditions of life. Anyone that studied architecture, for my sins, I have, knows that the modern movement in architecture is completely obsessed with this term, conditions of life. The Bauhaus, Hannes Meyer, is speaking about, the architecture, the kind of conception is that, humans are kind of like a muscle without a shell, could not survive. The survivor, the architecture should provide a condition of life. The city should provide a condition of life. It's a kind of, if you like, a biopolitical apparatus that allow people to receive the medical aid, the food, through acts of distribution, the shelter, and so forth, the temperature that they need in order to survive and to multiply. And that is clearly that kind of biological obsession of modern architecture with condition of life. Is that so? For me, they're talking about architecture, calculated. The calculation of conditions of life mean that in that prohibition on genocide, there is, the act is not on the body, the act is on the environment, which would transfer that act onto the body. So it's a kind of an indirect act of destruction. And in this indirectness, I would affect the city, the environment, the landscape, the forest, etc. And that the consequence of that would be your destruction. that we can start opening a big space and time between the act and its consequence that fits very much the duration of settler colonial violence, because we know that in settler colonialism, you know, you're looking at the proportion of indigenous people who've been exterminated in North America, for example, the very minority of whom have died from direct violence. No, they're dying from the restriction of condition of life. They're no longer next to in the environment that could sustain them as people. So this is something that is incredibly important. And when you look at Gaza, you see that what has been destroyed are the conditions of life, the hospitals, all infrastructure that exists within the, let's say, the first meter under the surface, what we call the thick surface of a city, has been destroyed as the material, mechanical, let's say, infrastructure that buttresses life, not only biological, no, mosques and school as cultural life, and the soil itself with, you know, for example, the water, the salty water that Israel has put into the soil that are actually salinated, like in Carthago, no, that when you kind of make sure that nothing would be able to grow, you kind of poison the depth of the earth as the biological infrastructure of life that could evolve on top of it, calculated to bring about the destruction. It would bring about the destruction in a different duration. And then you ask the question, given the ceasefire that has been started to be put into effect, and we don't know if it's going to last, and you know, all bet is it not, on the 17th of January, is there going to be, has the genocide ended? Right, act of killing, I don't know, Israel violated, but still, you know, you could argue that if direct killing have perhaps ended. The conditions of life have been designed, and we just today have read that, you know, Trump has decided that his idea is to evacuate all Palestinians because, again, there is no conditions of life in Gaza, therefore expulsion. And the destruction of the environment is undertaken again in two ways. And this is where ethnic cleansing or forceful transfer sneaks back into the Genocide Convention. Because if you want to destroy people's ability to survive, you move them from their place. You move the Over Herero from the Windhoek Valley into the Asab. And you move the Ishil Maya from their mid-height on the mountain onto the valleys where they could not, or onto the top of the mountain where they don't have, you know, what they need in order to survive. Or if they stay in place, it's like you pull the rug from under them. No? And that's an architectural act. So it's a human action on architecture, and architecture understood as a set of calculation in relation of life. And you know, in a sense, this field of calculus was a mode of control, Israel mode of control of Gaza, that goes back decades, in a way that Israel restricted continuously water, restricted loans for industry, restricted the conditions of life in order to generate a place from which people would want to live.
That's right, and that goes back to what I evoked briefly earlier, is the specific regime of settler colonialism, violence, or even genocide, which is this notion coined by Friedrich Ratzel, the German, I think it was an anthropologist or geographer, I don't remember, precisely at the moment where the genocide against the Nama and the Over Herero were happening. This notion of Lebensraum, that there is a people that needs a place, that needs more space, and that doesn't have the space that it needs, and it finds a space and it occupies the space. And the people who are on that space already cannot be considered as people worthy of that place, and therefore can be expelled. So that's the basis of this regime of violence, right? And so, which is predicated on the ethnic cleansing, which is predicated not only on the ethnic cleansing of the people, but also on denying the fact that these people were there and were actually displaced. So in a way, it's a generalization of, you know, what was the initial mantra of the Zionist project, which was a land without people for a people without a land. So it's kind of ironic that this notion of Lebensraum would be found at the core of the Zionist project. But that goes to a last type of pattern that we need to explore after the pattern that you've seen of repetition and complementarity in the genocide since October 2023, the patterns that sort of connect what's happening in Gaza with Guatemala and Namibia, also the patterns of what is happening now, and you just touched on it, what is happening now in Gaza with the deployment of Israeli policy since the beginning. So was there a project of ethnic cleansing since the beginning? How is it deployed? And this is something that you've started to work on, writing a book on Gaza that is provisionally called Ungrounding, and where you sort of make this long history of Gaza and the process of the deployment of the Zionist project in Gaza, which I think explains or illustrates the regime of violence that we just described.
So firstly, I think that Friedrich Ratzel's main laboratory, thinking laboratory, is the American frontier. I mean, he is a disciple of Turner, and he's looking at the way in which American pioneering spirit, frontier mentality, is the definition of that settler colonial project as the expulsion of the indigenous people, their concentration in places, in order to open that kind of Lebensraum. We should say that Lebensraum, from that kind of from an observation of the American frontier, ends up in Nazi ideology in Eastern Europe, where Hitler's kind of Eastern push is exactly to give the German people the Lebensraum, which is effectively a calculation of enough nutrition, enough soil to feed a growing population, right? So the German people could not actually survive without having access to primarily the Chernozem, the very fertile soil, and the agricultural areas of South Ukraine. So that is a conception that shows you that settler colonialism first, although it may say natives have not been there, indigenous people are not there, or they're not people, they are part of the natural environment, firstly tracks the geography, the indigenous geography, to know what are the best places. And the best places are the places most robustly inhabited. And these are the places that actually in settler colonialism need to give ground for the master race to displace the inferior people, or to, if they would not displace, to murder them. So the Lebensraum need to be dependent on another space, the extermination place. So you have a calculation of life, or life entering into calculus, in terms of productivity of land, in terms of economical viability, right? Those that are biologically supporting a certain, the kind of the proliferation of numbers of a population of a particular race. At the same time that you need to slowly calculate the destruction, slowly or fast, but initially settler colonialism worked with the kind of slowly constraining the possibilities of the life of the indigenous people to be. And this is what the reservations are. They displace people into the areas at the fringes of the productive zone without enough amenities or quality to enable life, where the density becomes higher, where people start dying out of epidemic and malnutrition. And that's the kind of slow death that is imposed through this idea. And that starts asking you questions about whether the term genocide even is suitable to describe those things. Because in the imaginary, in the kind of Shoah Holocaust imaginary of genocide, we're talking about a time-intense, direct killing, at least in the imagination. No? You take people, you transfer them into death camps, and you murder them in there. A time-intense decision and action, rather than protracted, sometimes century-long process by which indigenous people are calculated out of an environment in a particular way. And it's exactly that space-time that is open through that category of conditions of life. There's a potential there to open that up. And when you speak and try to understand the long history of Israeli settler colonialism and understand what has happened in the southern Palestine area, southern Palestine has been the last to experience the expulsion during the Nakba. So we're talking about after the last ceasefire, the majority...
So you mean the Gaza envelope?
The southwestern coast of Palestine, they inhabited, there was much further south, but it's not a densely inhabited area, but that area is very densely inhabited with farmers and with tribal societies along the arteries of the seasonal streams. And it is left for the last battles of the 1948 war. So starting October, Israel conquers and occupies Bir el-Saba, Beersheba today, which is sitting at one of the roots of Wadi Gaza. And
what is Wadi Gaza?
Wadi Gaza is the biggest water basin in southern Palestine, or in fact in Palestine at all. It's a huge basin that starts in the Hebron mountain of the West Bank, in which a lot of water and clay soil, very fertile agricultural soil, is draining from the mountain to the sea and makes all that basin one of the most fertile parts of Palestine. So when Zionists goes, they see, not only Zionists, the proto-Zionists, the kind of the Orientalist travelers to the Holy Land. No, most of them start in Alexandria and moves along the Via Maris, the coastal route, and walking through the desert, and all the description are the same. You know, the monotone. After arriving in Wadi Gaza, which drains into the Mediterranean just south of Gaza City, all of a sudden are saying, like they have like all a biblical revelation, no? The kind of monotone of the desert turn into the robust colors and open fields of Palestine. And it's almost kind of like a biblical transition between desolation and life that happens in Wadi Gaza. And all along the tributaries, you have the tribal farming communities of the Tarabin, of the Azazmen, the Jabarat, all those clans and tribes that, you know, in the areas called Bedouin Palestinians. And the Zionists notice that. They notice the quality of the soil. They notice that this area is extremely robust. In fact, that area exports the majority of barley for the British beer industry. So well before the British occupation of Palestine, the British are, you know, completely hungry for barley, because during the Industrial Revolution, this is the pub kind of is emerging as an institution, and you know, Liverpool beer industry is actually powered by Wadi Gaza barley that is exported over there. So that area, so again, you know, they come into an area, they see its robustness that tells them that there is something there. Then came the ethnic cleansing of 1948. People were actually expelled down the tributaries into the Gaza Strip. So roughly, maybe slightly less, but roughly half of Palestinian refugees that ended up in Gaza at the end of 1948 are coming from tribal background, Palestinian Bedouins. And this is a significant fact because they bring indigenous techniques now into Gaza, but they are farmers without land, and they're all crowded in the camps, and then starts that, so Zionist agronomists, most famous around them, Yosef Weitz, are starting to kind of like calculate the amount of water, of land, of amount of calories, and effectively building the settler colonial project around Gaza as what Ben-Gurion called the living wall. So around Gaza, initially, there is no, so after 48, when I say initially, there is no fence. There's a notion of where the ceasefire line is, and anyway, the Israelis keep on pushing it further and further to the west. And what protects the frontier are agrarian outposts, which are kind of military agrarian outposts that are built along the tributaries of Wadi Gaza, because effectively up the tributaries is where Palestinians return. Remember that the return, Palestinian return, well before it's the right of return, is a spontaneous act of farmers that were expelled into Gaza. They try to return home. So they move up the tributaries, they came down. Remember, third turning to the left, they kind of move up into where they were. And also the Wadi itself allows them to move less detected into that. So all those settlements are kind of on and along the Wadi Gaza tributaries with an instruction of shoot to kill any Palestinian, armed or unarmed, trying to return home. And then very fast they realize that what people return to is any remnants of what they have, and then they cross-plow the roads, they cross-plow the fields, so even the shapes of the fields are gone. They cross-plow, obviously, the buildings, etc., that were there, although there's a combination of tents and buildings in this particular part of Palestine. And then enters it's initially not part of the Green Revolution, but a kind of a proto-Green Revolution is a kind of a scientific experiment to create conditions of life different than what they were there, to amplify productivity, amplify the amount of gluten in the wheat that is, and barley that is produced, and in the calories from kind of legume that is being cultivated there, and the entire mechanism. And then the Green Revolution began, and particularly Israel is leading in the Green Revolution, and where the site of it is the site that Israel called the Gaza envelope, which is the area around Gaza. So what happened in 1948, well, there's never been a Gaza Strip before 1948. It's a consequence of the expulsion of Palestinians and the ability of the Egyptian to still control the road between Rafah and Gaza. And they are expelled there, and then two complementary geographical spaces and projects emerge on both sides of the ceasefire line, which, by the way, is marked with a plow, like Rome. It's just like they take a tractor and kind of plow a line, cutting directly through fields and orchards and villages, straight through it. And on both sides of that plow line, you have different type of calculation. On the envelope, a calculation that is designed to amplify life, conditions of life, and on the other side, to destroy them. To a condition of life, these are calculated to bring about the expulsion of Palestinians from this area, because what Israel has not been able to achieve in 1948, which is to occupy that last bit, this 1.3% of mandatory Palestine, where the Egyptians managed to defend his finger into that, was painful for the Israelis. They wanted to complete the Nakba and push them into Egypt. Egypt held, and that place was there. The way to do it was through the reduction of the possibility of living there, through damming Wadi Gaza, so water does not pass, and what passed were the kind of the chemical residue from the artificial fertilization, from the nitrate immediately after in the 50s, nitrate becomes very common as a form of synthetic fertilizer, and begins the Green Revolution with the kind of the conversion of nitrate factories from explosive into fertilizers. But in Palestine, there was another secret weapon, the Dead Sea, and of course the phosphates and bromium over there. You kind of short circuit the geology of Palestine. You take earth from the Dead Sea, pour it on the clay around Gaza, and boom, the amount of fertilization is incredible. I mean, that area produces more than half of the vegetational calorie intake of Israel around Gaza. And that was the area that was attacked. No, so it's not like there are settlements beyond the fence around Gaza. The settlements are the mechanism of siege. The envelope puts the strip under siege, but you need to think about the envelope and the strip as two conditions in which life is calculated in a very different way, for very different aim. But the calculation is the same. So the minute that you start with calculation, that you speak about Lebensraum, you need to speak about its opposite. When you speak about biopolitics, you speak about necropolitics. And this was exactly the yin-yang of the Gaza Strip and an envelope.
So as you just explained it, it seems like Israel has the same project from the beginning, from 48 on, and which of course would validate the notion that it's a continuous Nakba, gradual, slow, but that's the purpose. The purpose is to create Eretz Israel, so the greater Israel, which would be solely the land of the Israeli Jews, and the Palestinians would disappear one way or another. That seemed to be project from the start. At the same time, there are ostensible shifts in Israeli policy and in Israeli, maybe even imaginary. For instance, what I'm thinking about is an article published by another common friend, Niv Gordon, an Israeli historian, that he published around 2010, if I'm correct, where he insisted on the fact that there were two operating principles at different times. That from 67 to the first Intifada, so from the Six-Day War when there's the occupation of the West Bank and the occupation of Gaza, until the first Intifada, the Israeli project was not so much to expel, but to depoliticize the local Palestinian population. And that in fact, if we're talking about condition of existence calculated, there the calculation was calculation towards a slight improvement of their living condition, of the Palestinian population under occupation, a living condition, so that they would abandon their political hopes of an aspiration for free Palestine. And that kind of stops around the time of the Oslo, what will lead to the Oslo Accords, where the principle of colonization, but a colonization that would improve the life of the colonized so as to appease them, is replaced by what he calls the principle of separation, where ostensibly it's about creating a two-state solution, but in fact it's about pushing away the Palestinians so that Israelis wouldn't have to see a Palestinian again in their lives. And so that sort of is this slow process that will lead to the reawakening of the ethnic cleansing and the expulsion imaginary. So how do you balance these two? First of all, do you agree that there was like shifts both in policy and imaginary, and how do you balance them?
I think that in my earlier work, I had much more patience and attentiveness to the nuance in Israeli policy. But I tend to think now that, of course, there are contradictions. There are political contradictions. There are different players. There are different plans. There are different methods. I think that the meta constant of Israeli politics in Palestine is effectively the complete land of Israel and the complete ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. I think it has different temporalities, it has different aims, it has different means in which it is undertaken, and within that you have a kind of the idea of pacification, temporary pacification through improvement of condition of life. So, Sharon, at the same time that he tries, and here's the contradiction, no? Sharon is trying to expel Palestinians, just like what Israel is doing now.
When are we talking about?
We're talking about immediately after the occupation. The occupation is, Israel called it the 6 Days War. The Palestinians called that period the 4 years war, from 67 to 71, in which the Palestinian armed organization continue the war with the whatever weapons they could grab from the retreating Egyptian army after the Israeli occupation of Gaza Strip and the Sinai. Sharon is continuing this very same push from north to south. We haven't spoken about it, but effectively the genocide, to our understanding, began on the 13th of October, when Israel is delivering an evacuation order for the safety of the Palestinians. So imagine, on the same day, on the 13th of October, is the day that the President of Israel said there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza, where the minister, at the time now the Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, is saying, we would starve them out until they all move out of the world or leave. And at the same day, there's a lull in bombing, and what the Israeli legal defense in The Hague calls millions of A4 leaflets are falling onto Gaza and telling people, for your safety, you need to move south of Wadi Gaza. Remember, we spoke about Wadi Gaza before, that notion of the threshold of the desert, i.e. from the more water-rich part of the Gaza Strip down to the more desert part of the Gaza Strip at this particular moment. That action has been a kind of, has echoes and precedents throughout Israeli history in Gaza. Initially, the Israelis are trying to push the Palestinians during the 48. They're unable to do that. We spoke about that before. In 1952, they tried to convince the Egyptians and the UN to move Palestinians from Gaza to Egypt, and if not, at least from northern Gaza, into a number of villages that in the 50s they want the Egyptian government to build along the Via Maris in the north of the Sinai Desert, along a sweetwater canal from the Nile that they're planning to do. Later in the 50s, they raid the Palestinian refugee camps in order to force them to leave. In 1956, when they first occupied, they want them to leave. Every time it stopped politically, all through Palestinian perseverance and resistance. And then in 67, Sharon is using the counterinsurgency, again, to do the same thing, to attack the two big refugee camps in northern Gaza, namely Jabalia and Al-Shati, and to push them into the refugees, through the counterinsurgency, generate enough destruction in the camp so people would leave to Egypt. Also, that does not succeed, but something else happens. At the same time, Sharon is involved in promoting housing for refugees, and him and Dayan is the Minister of Defense, obviously, at this time, think that the problem of refugees is an urban problem of political identity, i.e. because the squalor in the refugee camps buttress a certain political ideology of refugees, what means being refugee is wanting to return to, you know, the area, and most Palestinians come from the area just around Gaza. If they would give them decent housing, they would just stop being political and, you know, would be content with it. I.e., pacification, which is another constant, you know, colonial technique by the French in Algeria and by the British in Uganda and in other places. No, you build housing in order to pacify, so that they will have something to lose. And at the same time, you know, you kind of allow people to work or be integrated, be proletarianized as manual, unskilled labor in Israeli industry and agriculture. In fact, Palestinians were going to cultivate the very fields from which, at this point, their parents were expelled, right? So that is one of the trajectories that is, you know, mirrored today, or just before October 7th. That was clearly Netanyahu's policy. No, I mean, bring Qatari money, allow the development of Gaza so that people would create leverage by letting them have something to lose in that respect. And that this depolitization through architecture did not work. But the more fundamental and constant, and even that depolitization for that is just temporary, because the more fundamental move was always the reduction of conditions of life. Even when they were allowing the integration of Palestinian manual laborers into Israeli economy, they were still damning Wadi Gaza and damning, quote unquote, the Palestinian industry by not allowing credit. You cannot have industry without credit. The economy was shekel, it was lira economy at the time, now shekel, but like, so Israel has control over the financing of what is happening there, and there was no loan, there was no factories, they were not getting planning permission, they were not allowing to drill wells, there was no water coming in, as you know, Golda and Eshkol were saying quite clearly, so that people would be just like, would just like have enough and leave. And I think that is the more constant kind of meta direction, though, you know, the other one does exist and did exist. Rather than a period, it is something that kind of interlaces with it as part of the kind of contradictions of Israeli state economy. And now, again, no, I mean, the idea of the reconstruction that we are subjected to now, no, I mean, Trump wants to evict everybody into Egypt, and Saudis would build like some kind of Dubai on the Mediterranean, and then, you know, who wants to start a war from Dubai, no, supposedly. I think this is naive and idiotic, because the Palestinian rights are, you know, equally held and insisted on by, you know, Palestinian refugees living in dire conditions, by Palestinian middle class, and by the Palestinian intellectuals in Europe and the US. There is no, you know, the rights is a right, it's a political right, and it's not being buttressed to economic necessity. It's never worked, that this approach.
So, last episode or last part of the exploration is in a way to treat you as a witness, and in order to explore, I mean, there's always been resistance for obvious reasons, and that's a good thing, to your work, since you're exposing or meaning to expose human rights violation, not only in Palestine, but all over the place. But with respect to Israel and Palestine, did you see a difference, or did you experience a difference? And I think I can say yes, but I'll let you answer, in the reception of your work since October 7, or rather since you decided to work on this major report. Difference in many ways, difference in the reception in the media, difference in the type of challenge that you encounter from governments, not only Israeli governments, but Western governments altogether, but also difference in the type of relationship, solidarity, expectation that you have from the people that you work with. So is there a shift there, or is it same old, same old?
There is an escalation and aggravation of patterns that existed already. And of course, the pushback existed before, but we have not experienced the way in which it could be weaponized. And particularly, so, you know, forensic architecture is now at the heart of what we call the investigative commons. And investigative commons are offices that are usually run by graduates or former students in many places worldwide, in Mexico and in Bogota and in Istanbul and in Ramallah, we talked about, and in about a dozen places worldwide, one of the bigger one of which was Berlin, the organization called Forensis. And actually in Germany we always had an enormous amount of support because we were working on things that are important for German society, like, you know, the sort of the way in which neo-Nazi or extreme right activism penetrates the police and secret services, and the way in which the people that are supposed to protect people with migrant background are becoming perpetrators. And we exposed several of those in Hanau in relation to the massacre in Hanau in 2020, in relation to what is called the NSU murder spree in the end of the 90s and beginning of the 2000s.
Which was, in a couple of sentences, what?
These were neo-Nazis who were targeting migrants. And in one of the cases, they have entered, two murderers entered an internet cafe in Kassel, run by a family who's from Turkey. And they've murdered the kid, Halit Yozgat, who was, you know, manning the reception. And so far, like any other neo-Nazi attack in Germany of the series that the NSU, the National Socialist Underground, has undertaken, only that in this one, in that internet cafe sat a Verfassungsschutz agent. Verfassungsschutz is like the internal security, it's like the FBI of Germany. So you have an FBI, German FBI agent, sitting at the site of a Nazi murder, disappears, does not give testimony. What is he doing there? And we've taken that question, we've reconstructed really in physical reality at the House of World Culture. We've got the budget for it. We've built a one-to-one model of the internet cafe. We had the login and logouts of every witness in it. I mean, if you conduct a murder, don't do it in an internet cafe because all the timing is perfectly synchronized like that. And we reenacted it with actors, and we conducted a number of experiments that kind of like really showed that he couldn't, as he claimed, the Secret Service agent, not have heard, seen, or smelled the consequences of this murder. So, you know, but based on that, we were like some kind of darlings of the German art scene. You know, we invited dozens of exhibitions, documenta. There was a lot of funding for our work, and then we moved into investigating the German colonial genocide of Namenov Herero people, etc. And still there was support for that. And when you apply the same evidentiary standard on Palestine after October 7th in Germany, we started to be targeted online, and with false allegation in newspapers and in completely ridiculous claims that I myself was anti-Semitic. And, you know, it used to be that they were saying to Jews, you know, you are a self-hating Jew, no? That this we know and love, because, you know, we are Jews, and some of us hate ourselves for multiplicity of other reasons that are very good. But that was shocking to
go from self-hating Jew to
anti-Semite. To anti-Semite, and that meant for us, and then you know, the budget and funding for this organization drained down, and effectively its shadow of itself and likely or possibly going to close very soon.
Your office in Berlin.
The office in Berlin, yeah.
So just to stress it, German society and even German state agencies are liberal enough that they like, to an extent, you to be the darling of the cultural scene when you expose
That's what's there.
That's right. When you expose the link between the neo-Nazi and the Secret Service, when you expose the first genocide of the 20th century committed by the Germans, but when you attack Israel, that's where the buck stops.
That's where the buck stops. And that is where you start understanding that anti-Semitism is something, and the allegation of anti-Semitism that we're experiencing also in the UK and in many places, and Goldsmiths is now the university where we are based, is undergoing through a kind of investigation for anti-Semitism, and I think we are one of the, they cannot say, but I think we're probably one of the main culprit of that thing, is becoming something else. It's becoming less about the fact of whether you are a Jewish person, a diaspora Jewish person, and it starts to become a symbol for a kind of a shift, a cultural shift, and a certain cultural shift to the right, in which anti-Semitism is understood as something that is being imported into decent German and European society, that is worked out its old white anti-Semitism, and it becomes a problem of migration. No, so it becomes the and then after October 7th, the Palestinians that come into Germany that are the epitome of a new kind of anti-Semitism that Germany has otherwise gotten rid of, and those others, liberals that support migration or people who are joining the Palestine liberation struggle, are by definition part of that anti-Semitism. And it stops becoming necessarily about Jews even. No, it becomes everything about migration, and it becomes everything about national identity of Germans as Germans, the uniqueness of German held through the identity as perpetrators that is being questioned, i.e. the Germanness is being questioned. It's not even about protection of Jews. How, on the eve of Kristallnacht, on November 2023, they're trying to legislate a set of rules for the protection of Jewish life in Germany that actually impose limitation on migration, on nationalization of migrant, test and all sort of other repressive moves towards migrant that would obviously make Jewish life in Germany more precarious. Because if you are the reason for those things to be legislated, you're going to pay the consequences of that. So that is not about Jewish safety. It's all about Germans' own identity, the German uniqueness, the German burden. German burden become their defining characteristics that would allow a certain thing to be. And Israel celebrates it, promotes it, etc. So, and we were caught in a storm that was much bigger than us, and the consequences we were kind of bearing, at least in Germany, on our ability to do, the funny thing is that the German office, Forensics, did not even do work on Gaza. We did one small project about German arm import or export to Israel, and which was mobilized in legal cases and delayed some arms export, which was very good. But that was a minor project. Most work on Palestine are done from London and from Ramallah, and the work that they were willing to give up, the work that they were really appreciating because of our kind of position on Palestine. It's another question. There's a whole German neurosis going on now to do with their own identity and dealing with society and migration that is very troubling and has multi-layers that I don't know that we can unpack here, but that was maybe the most important consequence. Also, I should say that things have changed in the open source community. So we started the conversation saying that, the open source was a kind of a disruptor of traditional journalism, of traditional human rights, of international law. I became an advisor even on the ICJ, on the ICC, the International Criminal Court in The Hague, about new kinds of evidence and how they can reformulate or add to legal processes.
You're still associated with the ICC.
Yeah, and slowly, like any kind of thing that emerges out of combination of political activism and a kind of technological know-how and aesthetic innovation that was something fresh and new, it started to be hoovered initially by corporate media, what today is called legacy media. The New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, others were kind of taking Bellingcat and forensic architecture technique. You see them everywhere now. They become mainstream. Then also secret services and militaries and police forces have started adopting it. And what has become as a radical practice turned into a system of technique that is anything but, and really not even open source, because the New York Times would not even share with other investigators the kind of the source material in a way that we would do that. And the politics is also gone with it, and people who were previously, because of that hoovering in of that, the kind of the initial radical spark of that technique by corporate media and state organizations, people became reluctant to share material online. And in Palestine particularly, if you film an Israeli soldier shooting a Palestinian in the West Bank and you upload it, they would trace back. They would do a kind of a forensic, walk back forensics and find you, and you'd be arrested at best. Or if your CCTV camera on your shop captures something, they'll smash into it, break everything, take the hard drive, etc. So people stop uploading online. We are now at an environment that we theorize as post-open source. It's not that there is no, the absolute number of things online is not growing all the time. It does grow all the time, but the critical material that is operational to kind of show something is happening is only given to people that the person that has recorded it trusts. When we investigated the Israeli targeted killing of Shirin Abu Akleh, perhaps the most well-known Palestinian journalist from Al Jazeera, the anchor of Al Jazeera Arabic News, who's documenting day in, day out the crimes of the occupation, was shot in Jenin in May 2022. There was a video with which we have finally made that reconstruction that was only given to Al-Haq, because they are part of the Palestine liberation struggle. So you cannot do, when the open source has been contaminated with bad actors, the sharing is being restricted. And this is part of the reason why we fragmented into all those organizations that are back on site, in Mexico, in Bogota, in Istanbul, in Athens, in all those places where we are doing this work.